so reconvening, it's a great honor to have Isaac Rodriguez Chavez, formerly of the FDA, most recently head of decentralized trials at the big CRO Icon, Jason O'Meara, formerly of Quest Diagnostics, lately last few years with Pfizer. They'll tell us a bit more about their backgrounds. Guys, we've got a packed room here, folks that are kind of active in the decentralized science space. And today's been a day focused on getting the DeSci community to think about the importance of compliance and standards and kind of building with that in mind in order for these innovative new models such as DAOs, decentralized autonomous communities, where rare disease patient groups, they might start crowdsourcing real world evidence that might be valuable in drug development, or other kinds of DAOs like Vita DAO, in which Pfizer's an investor and participant, Pfizer Ventures, allocate funding to early stage research that then might later on be taken up in product development pipelines, developing means of tracking and monetizing downstream value creation to patients or patient communities or scientists in order to strengthen their involvement in innovation when, particularly when there's room for improvement, say in the diversity of clinical trials and so forth. So I'm going to ask each of you first to briefly sort of give the audience kind of brief background that's relevant. Isaac, kind of your scientist background, your FDA work, your ICON work in DCT, and your experience in that space, and Jason, you played a key role with two of the largest companies in the world in getting big enterprise to entertain the potential of blockchain, first at Quest Diagnostics and founding the Synaptic Health Alliance, the first health enterprise consortium to explore the potential of blockchain technology with Humana, United Healthcare, and others. And then you launched the Blockchain Center of Excellence at Pfizer a few years ago. So if you could just, let's start with Isaac. Isaac, give the audience a brief background and then pass the ball to Jason. I've got some questions for you guys that'll help the DeSci community think about how to make the long-term impact of what they're doing more scalable with compliant data. Isaac, what's your story?
Thank you, Jason, for the opportunity to be here. And hello, colleagues, everyone who is watching us. I am honored and delighted to be here with all of you. I'm Dr. Isaac Rodriguez Chavez. I am a clinical scientist, basic research scientist, and a clinical scientist in training, education, and credentialing. I have been around for a number of years, probably close to 30 or more. I have worked in the federal government, I have worked in the industry, I have worked in nonprofit organizations. In the federal government, I worked in the National Institutes of Health, as well as the Food and Drug Administration. I have been senior official in those organizations. I have helped with the implementation of policies in decentralized clinical trials, real world evidence, the use of clinical outcome assessments in the midst of COVID-19, and so on and so forth. I have also been boots on the ground working on one of the largest clinical research organizations, ICON PLC, in which I led a Center of Excellence for Decentralized Clinical Trials and Digital Medicine for the implementation of technologies to enable decentralized clinical trial and modern trial design. I have worked in the industry, Shine Cloud Corporation / Merck. I have worked in the Texas Biomedical Research Institute, spearheading research projects, and that's essentially my story. I am delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. And Jason?
Hello. Thanks for having me here today. Hello to the entire audience. It's a privilege to be here representing Pfizer and previously my work with Quest Diagnostics. So I've had a long, career tenure working with blockchain technologies. First at Quest Diagnostics, when we brought together the Synaptic Health Alliance, that was really we were looking to tackle the hardest challenges in healthcare by bringing together some of the biggest players in healthcare, Aetna, Centene, Cognizant, Humana, Multiplan, Optum, Quest Diagnostics, Providence, and like I was one of the founding members with representing Quest Diagnostics at the time. That organization continues to make headway in some of the use cases that they're tackling. And since then, I've moved on to Quest Diagnostics, or to Pfizer, and I'm the vice president in digital organization within our digital strategy and alliances organization. So within this group, I'm responsible for alliances, including our Blockchain Center of Excellence. We've been doing a lot of work advancing blockchain use cases for the biopharmaceutical industry, predominantly through organizations like PharmaLedger, which was a European-based. It was initially founded by the IMI out of Europe, but has since then graduated to a global platform, as well as MetaLedger and some of the other blockchain consortiums that exist, trying to tackle some of the biggest challenges in the life sciences industry.
And
Good to be here.
Thanks, Jason. A few hours ago we had Dan Fritz, Marco Cuomo from PharmaLedger speaking. So that's awesome. The first question, it goes to Jason, and it'd be great to hear from you what, based on your experience pulling all these big health enterprises that have lots of liabilities that their general counsels usually use as the basis to say, no, you can't do this, especially when it's collaborative. What are lessons from the founding of the Synaptic Health Alliance and the Blockchain Center of Excellence at Pfizer, which sounds like inherently was about partnering outside with different entities for decentralized science initiatives, whether they're research DAOs or funding DAOs or other forms of more decentralized activity, for them to think about sort of compliance and standards in being able to effectively partner with pharma or regulators or, frankly, just large health systems?
It's definitely true. It's, I guess, to really get the lawyers on board, first start with the business value first and foremost. Find those very compelling use cases that different organizations across the healthcare ecosystem or life sciences ecosystems have a high stake in. Like, what's something that everyone is mutually interested in advancing, and those use cases is how you anchor the discussion. So always anchor the use case, always anchor it to the business value, to the different constituents and what you're collectively trying to achieve by coming together. So that's first and foremost, start with that. Then you've got to talk about the governance and operating model to make sure that you can, effectively the value transfer between these different constituents, and the work that each of these constituents have to do is equally and appropriately valued in that value exchange. And then finally, you come around to the technology, because the technology is how we actually accomplish those things that have been aligned in the prior two steps. And how the technology is also very important, like Jason was saying, because especially when we're thinking about the long-term value of data exchange within the healthcare ecosystem, you've got to be thinking beyond your current use case. So for example, when the Synaptic Health Alliance was tackling provider data exchange, we decided to be very forthright and intentional about adopting technology standards in the data representation of provider data, because we didn't know how that data would be used beyond the current use case at hand, and data interoperability is an extremely important concept for the entire industry overall. So there's many standards that have been defined over the years by different organizations like CDISC or HL7 or other industry consortiums that define data standards. And I definitely recommend leveraging those data standards or those interoperability specifications so that we're all speaking the same language in healthcare, and don't reinvent a new language just because you're bringing forward a new, let's say, transport and governance protocol that's represented by blockchain technologies.
And on a similar theme, Isaac, you were at the FDA and leading policy and guidance development that really was revolutionary, opening new pathways to use decentralized clinical trials, to use real-world evidence. Some in the, let's say, the calm before the pandemic storm, and then some in the midst of the storm. What lessons or input do you have to the decentralized science community on how to get big regulators, especially the FDA, because that's the most important one usually, to be open to new technologies or new models or new ways of doing things? How did DCT, and beyond the congressional mandates for the FDA to actually explore that, right? That was part of the story. But how do we get agencies to be open-minded about these new models?
So, in the first place, I am not representing the FDA. I am representing myself. I am not representing any other organization that I have worked for in the past. At the present time, I am an independent consultant in scientific affairs, clinical research, and regulatory affairs, and I am representing myself. So there have been a series of lessons learned, or actually lessons that we are all learning. I would say the different sectors involved in clinical research. The open-mindedness exists, the guidance, and the proof of that is that the guidance documents have been issued for decentralized clinical trials, for the use of digital health technologies to acquire clinical data remotely in clinical investigations. There are a series of guidance documents that represent the regulatory framework that supports decentralized clinical trials. There are a series of guidance documents that are connected to real-world evidence. The agency and the commissioners of the agency have been really open and vocal in saying that they are open and accepting submissions that include DCT approaches and real-world evidence approaches. The point here is the regulatory standards, the regulatory expectation for this kind of trials is the same as compared as traditional clinical investigations. So it's not that there is a new set of regulations for this kind of investigations. The expectations from the regulatory standpoint are the same. The rigorous thinking and rigorous design of the clinical trials from the protocol development perspective. So the rigorous science needs to be there. And evidently, to avoid many of the issues that happened in the past, the difference here is that there is a major change in the paradigm between traditional clinical investigations and modern trial designs. In this new renaissance of clinical research, in this digitization and transformation that is happening, the paradigm really is centered around the patient, the participant. And so any participant-centric approach that will lower the burden of the participants in the clinical investigations are the major centerpiece for decentralized clinical trials and for real-world evidence. These trials will be deployed or conducted in the communities where participants live and leverage the standard healthcare systems that exist in the communities where these participants live. So that is a major difference. So there has to be not only the rigorous science as always, the same expectation from the regulatory standpoint, but also the operational logistical feasibility to be able to conduct these trials in the communities where they will be done. So these are lessons that we are all learning and how to do it together. There is also another important component. There has been a historical problem in terms of including diverse populations in traditional clinical investigations. So we are learning, and rightfully so, after the FDA publishes the latest two guidance documents on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the FDA has been working on this topic for many, many years, since the early 2000s. But the latest two guidance are very, very clear in terms of the language that they provide and signal the entire community, pharmaceutical industry, about the importance of advancing clinical trial diversity and recognizing the importance of addressing the gaps in clinical trial diversity, The idea is to aim to ensure that research studies include a diversity range of participants. And this is a major emphasis on diversity to ensure that the results of the clinical trials are applicable to the broader population and can lead to a more inclusive healthcare outcomes. So that is a major take-home message. We're learning how to do this in clinical investigations. There is also another lesson that we're learning, that there is medical impact beyond the hospital and beyond the clinical research sites. And so this is where DCTs and real-world evidence can actually impact the clinical research enterprise because of the settings where these are happening. We are also in the process of learning about common data standards. And like I said, the regulatory expectations are the same for any kind of clinical investigation. So there has to be quality in terms of the data that is produced, and there has to be standards to develop that quality in the clinical data that is produced, either using remote activities or using centralized activities. And we are also learning about the evidence generation strategies and how they can be more flexible to open opportunities to conduct this kind of trials. I mentioned the importance of the digitization. This is a transformative movement that is happening and that has been in all sectors of the society, including our sector, biomedical field. And so the digitization of the clinical investigation, the implementation of technology ecosystems is critical for advancing these modern trial designs and to help in lowering the burden of the participant. And so those are things that I would say are major important. I mentioned quality, integrity of the data, excuse me, the gradual evolution of the clinical research enterprise, and with that, the regulatory science is also something to see and to appreciate, because many years ago, we were not using real evidence, or evidently decentralized clinical trials were used, but in a known fashion, if you will. And there has to be compliance from the regulatory standpoint, from the ethical standpoint, in all of these clinical investigations, and the ethics and the regulatory and the legality matter of these investigations are the same for all clinical investigations.
That's really helpful. To summarize, it sounds to me like make sure you're as rigorous or more rigorous with documentation and audits and so forth, and validations throughout the process.
I would not say more rigorous. Okay. That actually will put a dampen on the implementation of these modern technologies, and we have gone through that lesson learned as well.
Okay.
No, you don't have to be more rigorous. You have to be just, your level of rigorosity has to be the same, essentially. Mm-hmm. It's just the same regulatory expectation as with any other clinical investigation.
Okay, so yes, and have justification and demonstrated benefits in patient centricity and or diversity, equity, inclusion in trials and so forth. So that's really helpful, and that has implications for protocol drafting, right? And therefore, the protocols for IRBs, and ultimately documentation that you present to the FDA if you were in discussion with FDA officials for an IND or something. That's super helpful. Jason, back to you. We've spoken before about protocols, technology protocols, and governance, and you have some really insightful thoughts given your experience on governance beyond just protocol, beyond code, right? And it's actually interesting. There's another room here where Q, the organization that works in DeSci and other spaces, they have their T-shirts that says "Code is law," and then the code is law is like scratched out, because part of their point is that there's more than just code required for good governance. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on governance, and particularly when you're managing different organizations that might be benefiting from shared use of a technology protocol.
Yeah, that's very true. And first of all, I should also mention that I'm speaking on behalf of myself
Yes.
instead of my organization through all of this. But I definitely do agree that you have to first align at the use case level and the governance level before you try to tackle the code level. So
It seems that we lost him.
Oh, no.
Well, so while he joins back, let me just add on to
Thank you.
what I was saying. And so Jason can come back. The diversity component is really critical. And you were mentioning that in summarizing what I just mentioned. The diversity component is actually spelled out in the latest guidance on equity, diversity, and inclusion from the FDA. And that guidance was issued in 2022 and essentially is asking the sponsors to include diversity plans to enroll diverse populations in their clinical investigations. And that is particularly critical in pivotal clinical investigations. So Jason is back, and now back to you.
Hi, Jason.
apparently my organization doesn't trust me to manage updates on my own schedule and pushed out a mandatory update at this moment. So, that's kind of a good case in point that, the organization has to determine what's best for itself as they adopt technologies, and really thinking through how things operate today into how things can operate in the future, leveraging concepts like decentralized ledgers, anchors of trust, and truly multi-party transactions that can be facilitated by blockchain technology. So always start with the use case that you're trying to tackle, and then move into how this technology can facilitate that. And we do believe that the digitization of clinical trials is a tremendous opportunity for not only Pfizer, but the broader life sciences industry. And we are willing to experiment and try out new approaches in leveraging real world data and evidence in new ways, in exploring multi-party transactions based on blockchain technologies, accelerating clinical trial recruitment through open and permissioned screening of electronic health records. That's one of the use cases that we tackled with IMI, for example. So we're definitely open as an organization to more decentralized approaches to operating and running our clinical trials, and conducting clinical research. And really, I think the best way to tackle this is through bringing together ecosystem partners that are mutually motivated to try something new and be willing to experiment. And Pfizer is certainly one of those organizations that's willing to try new things, but it can't be at the risk of reduced quality or going against regulatory frameworks that exist today.
100%. And this is interesting because I want to sort of follow up with it's a strategic question, and it has governance implications, because it sounds like when you've got a consortium or any kind of partnership, there's sort of technical alignment among the SMEs, but there's got all the organizations have to feel like trying this new thing out benefits all their bottom lines in some way, right? Maybe you're a nonprofit, right. Your bottom line is impact, not money, but still, everyone's got to benefit. So I say that as a preface to a question about the about the impact of decentralized clinical trial tech to date on trial budgets, because that's one of the things that and feel free if you haven't thought about it much to just punt. But one of the interesting things that the last couple years has been kind of reflections in the decentralized clinical trial kind of space on anticipated cost reduction of trials, because it should have gotten more efficient in terms of costs, and often the tech has its own costs that's thrown on top of a CRO budget that it doesn't want to give up any of its service margin. And so one is, do you have any thoughts on to date, DCT tech not necessarily bringing down trial costs. And two is, is collaborative sort of governance potentially a way to sort of shift the attitude towards the CRO vendors and figure out, like, how do we win together leveraging this technology to get efficiencies? We know you're used to being inefficient and billing us for labor and throwing a margin on top of that. We know this tech could cut into that, but how can ultimately patients benefit? The product gets developed faster. Patients have a better experience in trial, but also both of our organizations' bottom line succeed. I don't know, thoughts on that, and because my suspicion is where we'll first prove out the true cost savings impact of decentralized trial tech is going to be in those underfunded research spaces like drug repurposing, et cetera, where there's just not a lot of money to throw out, and you got to be super efficient. Whereas, the traditional big pharma sponsored trial market, you guys care more about, get this trial done a month earlier. That's worth a lot of money for us with the patent clock ticking, and it's a little bit less cost sensitive, right? So thoughts on DCT and trial cost, and whether my suspicion that a more collaborative approach to the CROs might yield better efficiencies.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that the big part of it is the collaboration and bringing together the multiple parties that have to work together to change industry around a given use case. But I also highly recommend that you think about all those dimensions of the use case, like technical feasibility, regulatory feasibility, data feasibility, as you're considering which use cases to try to adopt. And like adopting a use case square in the middle of, let's say, a pivotal phase 3 clinical trial, like organizations are definitely more risk averse, I guess you can say, at that point, versus something that might be further upstream or potentially associated with like clinical trial recruitment, something that may be associated with like clinical research, with where the different entities are happy to collaborate for the advancement of the greater good of populations of people. So definitely think through the overall risk of the use case as you also think about the benefits of the use case. And that's oftentimes the lens that we take, especially with technology. Well, blockchain has been proven in many use cases at this point, but oftentimes bringing these organizations together on a less, let's say, a less trying use case, like something that's a little bit easier to, get a win under the organization's belts, I guess you can say, with something that's a little bit less, with a more risk aversion. Yeah, it's probably a good thing. Because then after you prove it out with that first use case, those organizations can move on to something that's a little bit more core to their businesses.
That's a great point.
I can add.
Yes,
I can add to it. I would say that we are in the process of learning the costs connected to these modern trial approaches. We don't have all the use cases developed to understand how the comparison should be or could be between a traditional clinical investigation and a modern trial design, DCT, or real-world evidence. The truth of the matter is that in some instances, such as technology and the utilization, the cost of decentralizing, digitizing a decentralized clinical trial, or even a real-world evidence trial, are not necessarily equally equated when compared to a traditional clinical investigation. So it's not that there is a line-by-line comparison in terms of the cost. Some of the costs are unique to these modern trial designs, and it's not a wash-off compared to a traditional clinical investigation. Tufts University, there was a group that initially mentioned about the cost of a full decentralized clinical trials being 13.5 times more efficient than traditional clinical investigations, and hybrid decentralized clinical trials being about 6 times more efficient than the cost connected to traditional clinical investigations. But this is a very preliminary observation, number one, because we are still really learning about this. And even after COVID, the implementation of DCT right now around the 15% globally. And so this is expected to continue growing. Now, this is not only about costs, because we need to think about what this represents in many other dimensions in terms of the kind of data that is collected, the continuity, the opportunity to collect data on a continuous basis, the opportunity to implement digital endpoints and novel endpoints, and the opportunity to actually see more holistically the health status of the patient according to protocol specifications, which is something that we will not be able to do earlier before in traditional trials because of the episodic nature of the visits in traditional clinical investigation. So to me, those are aspects that cannot equate from the cost perspective side by side in traditional versus modern trials. And the advantages from that perspective in terms of the data and the richness of the data and the holistic assessment of the patient while decreasing the burden of the participant and keeping it centric to the patient is something unique to these trials.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point that that digitally enabled trials make possible all lots of different kinds of future value creation off of that trial, whether it's with the the right additional consents, but also you mentioned digital biomarkers that AI can discover that then that data, if appropriate, if reused with the right consents and compliantly, can continue to create value in a way that a filing cabinet full of paper data, as you put it, episodic studies. That's right. Well,
Yeah.
I think
And also timeliness of information extremely important sometimes. Mm-hmm. When we were pursuing our COVID vaccine, for example, the timeliness of data in the movement of infection throughout the world was like essential to the study conduct. So sometimes, like in certain therapeutic areas and certain disease states, like timeliness is extremely important in having the appropriate consents and data accessibility in place prior to that event occurring is like invaluable, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of the optimization process and the optimization of efficiencies in all steps and aspects of the clinical investigation. That is also another major aim in the digitization and modernization of these trials. Make it more cost effective, make it more efficient, and even acquiring the data, processing the data, and reporting the data, because time, resources, and money are at the stake, let alone the safety of the participants that cannot be compromised. But bottom line, this is an enterprise that is testing safety and efficacy of novel medical products, and therefore there has to be standards and regulations and legal matters to operate and do this in an efficient manner.
100%. I'd like to ask the audience, does anyone have any questions they would like to ask our panelists? Sava, please.
Just around those timelines for the, getting those efficiencies that you're talking about around DCTs, obviously, and the use of WRE. Like, what's your view on, say, the ability for a drug to be repurposed based on synthetic data or RCT emulation? Does that go kind of hand in hand with decentralized trials? Where do you think the timelines are going to be when the FDA starts coming around to, being able to accelerate, drugs coming to market? Because that's really what everyone's looking for. And what do you think the main barriers are to that?
Okay, so if I'll restate your question, Sava, correct me if I restate it. What are your opinions, and so apply to both of you from your different perches, on kind of timeline for seeing the FDA accept I'd say synthetic trial or emulated trial data as part of of a submission, let's say synthetic trial data from real world evidence in drug repurposing, right? Let's say where we've got a lot of data and so forth. And perhaps with a submission coupled with, decentralized trial, RCT arms and leveraging real world evidence and so forth. But kind of a hybrid approach that, because some of the people at this conference are very active in the drug repurposing space, where frankly there's just not a lot of money to fund the trials because they're off patent, and so and we have a lot of RWD that suggests from off-label use, especially in oncology and some other spaces, rare diseases, that these off-patent drugs sometimes they could be really effective, and we need studies that might allow a generic manufacturer to, get an ANDA for it, or for a label expansion or something like that. But thoughts on cobbling together DCT and RWE, and maybe some of that RWE is a synthetic trial emulation?
So let me start by saying thank you for the question. That is a very important question, and there is not a final answer to it. So I'm sorry to say that. I hope that I'm not disappointing you, but this is a process that we're all learning about. In the first place, there are two components to your question in my mind. The first one is the use of synthetic arms or external control arms in decentralized clinical trials. And the external control arms come from the real-world evidence applications. And that is a utility, and that is an application that in some instances can be put in place, not only for repurposing drugs, but also for assessing novel medicines in the place. So that is an actual approach that is happening and can be utilized, and the agency is open to do it. So the second piece to this, according to what I heard in the original question, is the virtualization of trials. And so let me make a big difference here between what a virtual trial is and what a decentralized clinical trial is. Mm-hmm. And they are both being utilized by some pharmaceutical companies. So there is no mandate from the regulatory standpoint in that any sponsor needs to follow any specific approach to prove the safety and efficacy of any new medical product. This is up to the sponsor to come up with the innovation, to come up with the trial protocol, the protocol design, and present it to the agency as this is what we are proposed to do under an IND, investigation on new drug application, for instance, or a BLA or what have you. And essentially, the agency is not going to be prescriptive as to any specific type of trial design, but they will assess it to ensure the safety of the patient and the quality of the data, to prove that to make sure that that protocol will truly generate the evidence from the safety efficacy standpoint of that novel medical product. I hope that makes sense. So saying that, I would say virtual clinical trials are those that are happening in the preclinical phase when we are testing using in silico modeling, using assigned or imaginary participants, and assessing a promising compound that is in the preclinical phase for the safety and efficacy of that specific compound. That happens is computer modeling, is safety efficacy in computer modeling of a promising compound, and it's imaginary subjects, and it's virtual. That has nothing to do with a decentralized clinical trial in which happens in the clinical phase with real people, but using technology and doing it remotely. Mm-hmm. So these are two very different approaches. They complement each other. They are in different space during the life cycle of a medical product development. And so, yes, the virtualization of clinical trials is happening. And that is the second component that I may have understood from the question that was asked, even for repurposing drugs, because we can understand how that drug would behave in a hypothetical computer simulated situation. Mm-hmm. And so the advantages that you may have or one may have in repurposing a drug is connected to, we have an initial indication that that drug has been approved, or we understand the safety and the efficacy of that drug for that specific indication. There is some information that might be of value in terms of the safety, in terms of utilizing some of that data for the repurposing of the medication. But there has to be some other trials conducted to still assess the efficacy of that drug that will be repurposed. I hope that helps.
That was a fantastically in-depth answer. Jason, any final thoughts? I want to respect the time of both of you guys. It's been very great having you.
Yeah, no, I thought you hit it out of the park with that answer. Mm-hmm. And yeah, just final thoughts. This is the innovation that's necessary to advance breakthroughs that change patients' lives, and it's absolutely essential for everyone to keep pushing the envelope on what's possible, with a core of efficacy and safety in mind. So keep pushing on the envelope, keep exploring, because ultimately this is going to make everyone's lives better. So I definitely encourage the work being done here.
Thanks, Jason. Isaac, any final thoughts?
I appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today. If there are additional questions, I am available through LinkedIn. You can find my name. I am a public figure, so I am delighted with the level of engagement and the level of interest from the audience. And thank you to the two Jasons for the opportunity to share with you. And this is a conversation that is happening, that is not ending. Traditional clinical investigations are not going to be replaced by modern clinical trials. We are expanding the clinical research toolkit. Decentralized clinical trials are agnostic, can be applied essentially to all therapeutic areas if designed properly. We are just enhancing the clinical research enterprise, and this is a time and a space that is so vibrant and so energetic that if anyone and all of you are connected to clinical research directly, congratulations, because this is the time and the space to be. Clinical research is an enterprise that is really vibrant and requires the participation of all of us together. So thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Appreciate it. All right, take care. We'll keep in touch.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.